Good evening, everyone. Because maybe you don't even need this. It's good acoustics in here. All right, you can hear me now? Is that better? All right. Well, thanks for inviting me here this evening. It's wonderful to be here. This is, as the professor said, my first time in Denmark, and this is wonderful. I'm just enjoying being here, and I always enjoy coming to Europe. And you know, my wife said, "Are you interested in going to England?" And I wanted to come here, and I wanted to come to Sweden. So, but I want to go to Norway, you know, at some point, because I hear it's just beautiful. So, thanks. Anyway, let me tell you a little about myself that he did not cover. I became a Christian at the age of 10, and I didn't really grow too much as a Christian during my teen years. I ended up going to a Christian university where I was a music major, as you mentioned. And it was at that time that I became real interested in spiritual things. So I was reading the Bible. I got up to the point where I was reading the Bible a couple hours a day, and I was praying. By the time I graduated from college, I was praying probably an average of 2 hours a day. And I know that's just strange for a college student, but I was really interested in growing in my relationship with the Lord. So I decided that I wanted to get more in-depth with Bible study. I wanted to go into ministry. I wasn't sure what kind. And so I enrolled in a Master of Arts degree in New Testament Studies, and I did that primarily because I wanted to learn Greek. I took a semester of Greek as my last elective in my last semester of college, and I loved it. And I wasn't all that smart in college. In fact, I do have a learning disability, ADD, which means attention deficit squirrel. I really could not concentrate that well when I was in school. My dad tells me I have an average IQ. I would share the number with you, but I forgot it. But in all seriousness, I have an average IQ, and I did struggle with ADD until I found out that there was some medication to help me with that. But I struggled all throughout school. I was a C student, but I really wanted to learn Greek so I could read the New Testament in its original language. So I took Greek my final semester in college, and I got an A in it. I just loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. So I decided I wanted to go for a master's degree in New Testament so I could take all these Greek courses. And so I went into the dean of the grad school and I said, "Hey, I want to get into your master's program in New Testament and study Greek, really did a lot of Greek." And he said, "All right, and so how much Greek do you have right now?" And I said, "Well, I have one semester." He says, "Well, you need 3 before you get into that program." "Okay. And what's your major?" "Music." "Well, you really needed to be a religion major to get into it." "And what was your grade point average?" And I said, 2.0. And he said, "Well, you need at least a 3.0. And I'm sorry, you just don't qualify for the program." And I said, "Well, I understand, but I really want to learn. Is there a way that you could give me a chance?" And he said, "I'll tell you what, you go home this summer after you graduate, and you take a year's worth of Greek. There's Moody Bible Institute, and this was back in 1983, okay, before some of you were born. And you could do a distance learning course. They would send you these audio cassette tapes. Some of you will remember those. These audio cassette tapes, and there was no internet, no email, and you listen to these. Basically, computers were coming out at that point, and you write the answers, and you send it in through the mail, and if you do well, we can give you credit for it. So I took a whole year's worth of Greek over the summer that way, and I got A's on it. And so I came in, and I took my Greek entrance exam, and they told me I scored higher than anyone in the history of the school on that exam at that point. And it wasn't that I was smart. Obviously, again, I had an average IQ, I had a learning disability, but I had a strong desire to learn. And that strong desire, accompanied by discipline, can overcome a lot. So I got into all these Greek classes. I took as many as they would let me. I took a total of 10 graduate level courses on Greek, and aced all of those, and finally finished up my coursework. But my last semester in grad school, I started to have doubts whether Christianity is true. And it wasn't anything I'd learned. It was, how do I know it's true? I was born in a Christian family. Maybe that's why I'm a Christian. What if I'd been born in Afghanistan? Would I be a Muslim? What if I'd been born in India? Would I be a Hindu? Or China? Would I be an atheist? Is the reason I'm a Christian because this is the way I was raised. And I think I've got this relationship with God, but people of other religions are every bit as convinced about their views as I am about mine. Maybe I've just brainwashed myself. I thought I had this intimate relationship with the Lord, but people brainwash themselves, convince themselves all the time. Maybe that's what's going on with me. And I only knew about the Christian view, and I'd spoken with Muslims, and I told them they're wrong without even really knowing what they believed. So I'd want them to be open-minded to my view. Of course, they'd want me to be open-minded to theirs. And anyway, I'm starting to have all these doubts, and I'm thinking, how do I know if this is true? And then someone introduced me to Gary Habermas. I'd never had him for a course, but he was a philosophy professor, and I knocked on the door, and he invited me in, and he said, what's up? And I said, well, I have a roommate, he's got you as a professor, and I'm doubting my Christian faith. And he said, come to you. And he said, well, sit down, Mike, and don't feel embarrassed about this. I got students all the time doing this. And I was like, okay. So what's bothering you? So I started to share with him, and he gave me some answers about the resurrection of Jesus, and I got pretty excited about it. And I walked out of that office, and all my doubts were gone. And then I finished school and went home, back to my hometown, and started to share my faith with non-believers, and they bring up all these objections I'd never heard before. And it's like, whoa, is that true? And doubts came back. And so I'm wrestling with these for years and trying to find answers. And then, so I get excited about it, and then one day I realized, you know what, I've been seeking answers just to confirm what I already believe. Is that true research? If Christianity is not true, wouldn't I want to know that? I don't have to fear the truth. If Christianity is not true, I want to know that so I can stop believing it and go find out what's true. I mean, this possibly means eternity, and where I'm going to spend it and how I'm going to spend it. I mean, if atheism is true, I don't have anything to worry about anyway. Life is meaningless, and I'm going to waste my life no matter what I believe. If Hinduism or Buddhism is true, well, then I'm going to get many chances to get it right. But what if Islam is true? I'm going to be in a world of hurt when I die, and the way I spend eternity. So I was wanting to seek truth. And again, I felt like I had nothing to fear about truth. What I had to fear was my biases would get in the way so much that it would prevent me from discovering truth and cost me eternity. That's what haunted me at night. And so I decided I got a PhD program. I never thought I would do that. I got into a doctoral program and worked at my best to minimize the negative impacts of my personal biases. It's hard to do that. You have to make a deliberate effort, and it's got to be a consistent effort. I found that if I made the effort, I got to the point where I could be neutral and then moved on, I would come back to my biased position because that's just the natural point. So when I was doing my historical investigation on the resurrection, I found that I had to do my best to detach myself and say, okay, I believe this is true, but I do things to like, all right, well, if it's not, what can I do to minimize? All right, well, I'm a leader right now in the largest Protestant denomination in North America, and if I find that the resurrection did not occur, I could quit my job, write a book against Jesus, and become wealthy. So I would do these things to try to say, okay, well, I got to be unbiased here as much as possible. And I've set up things, put 6 controls in place to help minimize my bias. And then during my whole process, which took 5.5 years, I intentionally engaged in public debates with some of the leading skeptical scholars in the world. Because I figured I've got my biases, they have theirs, their biases are in the opposite direction. So, and they're smarter than me. So if there's some holes in my arguments, they're more likely to find them. And so before my debates, I would pray, God, if I'm wrong, show me. I don't care if you have to humiliate me. I just want to know truth and follow truth. And I'm going to be open-minded, whatever. So I pursued that way. And so I think this afternoon was my 31st debate. They've become a lot of fun now. I just enjoy them. And I've become more convinced than ever that Jesus actually rose from the dead because the evidence is really good. It can withstand the toughest critical scrutiny. So, as a professor remarked, I've written a book. My dissertation was published with some minor alterations and 700 pages, and so we're going to go chapter by chapter tonight. Page by page. So, if you have a babysitter, just say it's going to be a while. Actually, I'm gonna do this fairly quickly, and I'm going to make it so easy that even a Baptist can understand. So let's talk about this. And I also want to say, so Denmark is a great place to go. Very interesting, and I get to go a lot of different places that are fun. Last year, Palm Sunday, I got to return to my home church where I used to live in Virginia Beach. So my wife and I went back and visited, and the pastor, Michael Simone, and his wife, where's the power? Oh, okay, there we go. So after speaking at church on Palm Sunday, they invited us to this really nice Italian restaurant. Best Italian restaurant I've ever been to. It was just fantastic. Okay, thank you. So it was really good, great food. I remember I had linguine and spicy marinara sauce and big ocean scallops. Oh, so good. So we're sitting there at the table talking. And at one point, the pastor says to my wife and I, did you guys ever watch the television series Lost? Now, I realize I'm in Denmark, not the US, but I don't know what you guys watch over here. But anybody ever see the television series Lost? Oh, okay, great, lots of it. Well, my wife and I did not watch that when it was on, but after all the seasons were done, we had a Lost marathon. And we just, for maybe a couple of weeks, every night, we would just watch 3 or 4 episodes until we got through everything. We were just hooked on it. We said, yeah, we really loved it. And he said, well, do you remember the character John Locke? He was kind of a short, bald guy, muscular. He was a good guy. He had been paralyzed. He got his legs, and then he became the smoke monster toward the end. And he said, yeah. I said, well, he lives here in Virginia Beach. And then he leaned forward and he said, don't look behind you, but he's sitting in the booth right behind you. Well, people like entertainers, actors, I've never been really like, it just doesn't do anything for me. I thought, well, that's kind of cool. But anyway, I'll make this story short. Within the next 2 minutes, I had my picture taken with him. So, I get to go to some cool places. So, all right. So, the resurrection of Jesus. So, the resurrection of Jesus. Why is this important? Well, when you're looking at it, the different worldviews, you say, well, how do I know it's true? What are the truth tests that these worldviews give? When you look at Islam, on 3 occasions, the Quran says that if you want to know if Islam is true, create a surah, a chapter like one in the Quran. So here you go, one of those texts. If you are in doubt concerning what we have sent down unto our servant, then bring a surah, a chapter like it, and call your witnesses apart from God if you are truthful. So, again, read the Quran. Surahs are chapters. They're arranged not like a gospel. They're not like a long story, a narrative. They're more like the Psalms. They're not related in any way. And it starts off with the introductory surah, and then it goes from the longest down to the shortest. So the last dozen surahs of the 114 in there, the last dozen surahs are very short. And so just look at one of those. So I thought, oh, so that's it. It says, try to create one like this, and you will find that you're unable to do it, and it will convince you that the Quran is divinely inspired. So you're all, well, let's try to take this test. So let's look at one of the surahs. Surah 111. May the hands, so Abu Lahab was one of Muhammad's uncles, and he was a very wealthy uncle. He was the wealthiest of Muhammad's uncles, and he opposed Muhammad. So that's what the surah is about. It says, may the hands of Abu Lahab perish. His wealth avails him not, nor what he has earned. He shall enter a blazing fire, and his wife, carrier of firewood upon her neck, is a rope of palm fiber. In other words, you're going to burn forever, and your wife is going to carry the wood to help burn. So that's why it's important to marry the right woman. Okay? So this is the surah that's in the Quran. So what the Quran is saying is try to replicate something like this. Write your own surah to see if you can come up with something as good as this. All right, so let's take the test, I figured. I sat down, and in about 5 minutes, I created this surah. God will execute perfect justice on those who oppose him, but he is merciful to all who love him. Well, I suppose if I showed that to a Muslim, they might say, well, no. The Quran, when you read it in Arabic, and I've heard former Muslims who have become Christians say this, they'll say, look, the Quran, when you read it in Arabic, there's something special about it. So we don't believe it's God's word, but when you read it in Arabic, the language just flows in a beautiful way, in a rhythmic form. You've studied Islam, so you know about it. So it flows very rhythmically. It's beautiful in the way it does. Oh, okay. So I could do that in English. I could put a rhythm to it, maybe even make some words rhyme with the end. So how about this? 5 minutes later, the Lord repays the bad and good, accords to us by where we stood. I suppose a Muslim could say then, well, yeah, but it's not in Arabic, and Arabic is such a beautiful language. Well, is that what it comes down to? Beautiful language? I mean, is that like choosing between McDonald's and Burger King? Or it's personal preference? And what if I don't think Arabic is a beautiful language? What if I like the sound of other languages better? You know, like Danish, or French, or German, not German. So what if I like the sound of another language better? I mean, really, does it come down to such a subjective test about, I like the way it sounds? So it seems to me that the test that the Quran gives on 3 occasions is the only test it provides to know whether the Quran is true. That you can easily pass this test. In fact, several years ago, some Christians got together and they created what's called the True Furqan. The True Furqan. Are you familiar with that? And they wrote it. It sounds just like the Quran, and they wrote it in Arabic. And they would go on a bus, and they'd start reading it. And sometimes people would walk up to them and say, and they'd go on a bus reading it, but they'd do it in a Muslim country where Arabic was the primary language. And someone would come up to him and say, oh, thank you for reading the Quran. It's so beautiful. He says, but this isn't the Quran. This is the Furqan. And it would have Christian doctrine kind of stuff in it. And so it's like by Muslims acknowledging that it sounded just as beautiful as the Quran shows that you could create something just like it in the original language of Arabic. So it's not a very good test, I don't think. So then you talk to Mormons, and they come to your door. We have a lot of them in the United States. I hear you don't have too many of them here, but we have them in the United States. And what they will do is they'll say, we know Mormonism is true because the Book of Mormon says, if you open, and they open it up in the Book of Mormon, and if you want to know whether it's true, then just read the Book of Mormon, pray and ask God with a sincere heart to show you that it's true, and He will. They talk about a burning of the bosom. I don't know how to distinguish that from indigestion, but the burning of the bosom, they say. God tells them that Mormonism is true. So I figured, this is years ago, I had a friend who was a former Mormon bishop, a former pastor of the church, And we had become friends, and we knew we were going to talk to one another at some point. And we knew that we were going to talk to one another at some point. But I think we both knew that we wanted to have such a friendship that we knew the other person really cared. We knew that we cared about each other. That this wasn't just some, we're trying to do something so we can say we evangelized. We really cared about that person. So the day came and we started talking about it. He said, would you be open to talking to 2 Mormon missionaries? And I said, sure. After all, again, I don't have to fear the truth, right? And if Mormonism is true, why not become a Mormon? And so they came over, and I went to his house. The 2 Mormon missionaries came over, and I had told him ahead of time, I said, look, I know they're going to want to talk about all the doctrines of Mormonism, and I really don't care about that right now. I want to know if Mormonism is true. I want evidence. And that's what I'm going to want to talk about. And if they can't give me any evidence for Mormonism, then I'm not interested. If Mormonism is true, then I want to know everything about Mormonism. I want to know all the doctrines and everything. But I want to know that it's true first. So they said, okay. So while they were investigating, I'm investigating. I'm calling Brigham Young University. And I'm talking to their Book of Mormon professors. And I'm asking them questions about, like 2 of them. One guy was an archaeologist who practices up in New York, where many Mormons think the Hill Cumorah is. That's mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And another guy practices in Central America, where others think the Hill Cumorah is. That's mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So I asked each of them and said, have you ever found any archaeological evidence to confirm the Book of Mormon? And both of them, practicing Mormons, professors at Brigham Young University, professors of anthropology, they're both Book of Mormon archaeologists, that's their profession, both of them said no. I said, never? Nope. One guy, the guy that practices in South America, does his archaeological work there, he says, I have people every week who come up to me in church and say, have you ever found anything to confirm the Book of Mormon in archaeology? And he says, I tell them, no. How depressing. Devoting your entire career to that and never being able to find anything to confirm the Book of Mormon. So those were some of the things and some other things I looked into. So when I came to the house and met with the Mormon missionaries, they started talking. I said, so what's the evidence? And they said, well, we found archaeological evidence. I said, wait a minute. I just talked to David Johnson at Brigham Young. I just talked to John Clark at Brigham Young. They're professional Book of Mormon archaeologists. They told me there's nothing. Well, the church tells us that there is. I said, yeah, you know what? And they told me the church tells you guys that there's evidence from archaeology. And he says, John Clark told me, he tells the church, stop doing that. It's not true. So these Mormon missionaries that come to your door are saying, archaeologists have proven the Book of Mormon through archaeology, and that's not true. I could go on and on with that, but here's the thing. I said, look, I read a bunch of the Book of Mormon, as the Book of Mormon says. I prayed and I asked God with a sincere heart because I don't have to fear truth. And I believe God told me it's false. And they're like, well, where do we go with this? I said, look, you've been brought up Mormons, right? That's why you believe. So you got the Hill Cumorah, and the Book of Mormon says over 100,000 people were slaughtered on that hill around slightly after 400, the year 400. And their bodies were left to molder and return to the mother. That means they weren't buried. That's only 1,600 years ago. If that's the case, don't you think where are all those bones? Where we'd be able to find weapons and stuff? You know they haven't even found so much as a button on that hill? And, well, maybe God took the bones. Well, yeah, maybe he took the bones, but I mean, if you're going to do that, why not just say, well, maybe we were all just created 5 minutes ago with food in our stomach and meals we never ate, remember the events that never occurred. I mean, you can explain away anything like that. But you know what? I could believe something without a lot of positive evidence for it. I can't believe something if there's evidence against it and no positive evidence for it. I'm just sorry, I'm not interested in Mormonism. I think this thing about pray and believe and ask God and he'll show you that the Book of Mormon is true, it just seems to me that's not a very good test. When you come to Jesus, when you come to Jesus, John chapter 2, people come up to him and says, Lord, or Jesus, what sign do you show us that you have the authority for doing these things, cleansing the temple, overturning the tables? And Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it. And he said, well, it took 46 years to build this temple. And John adds that after he rose from the dead, they realized he was talking about the temple of his body. So he gives this resurrection as evidence that Christianity, that what he's saying is true. Now that's a pretty interesting test, isn't it? It's not just read this and pray and see if you get this nice feeling. It's not just take a chapter and try to write one like this and it's got to be in the right language, and it's got to have a rhythm, and it's got to be the language that I choose. And it's up to me to decide whether, it's up to you, Mr. Muslim, to decide whether I've accomplished it or not. It's like, kill me, I'll raise my body. I'll raise up in 3 days. That's a pretty good test. Now, of course, that's good for back then, but that doesn't help us at all today, unless we can show there's a reasonable chance that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And so that's when I started to study. What kind of evidence do we have for the resurrection? So, it's kind of like this. I heard John Meyer is a historical Jesus scholar who teaches at Notre Dame, and I heard him lecture once, and he said, no matter what you're studying in history, it's almost like you're playing a game of cards, and each card is a source. And it's like when you play a game of cards, in many cases, you wish you had more cards, you wish the card you had were better, but you still got to play with the hand you've been dealt. Historians always wish they had more sources, more cards. They wish the cards, the sources they had were better, but you still have to work with the sources that you have. Okay. So what do we do with this? What kind of sources, what kind of cards have we been given when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus? And is it sufficient? When we look at our sources, probably we think that our main sources are going to be the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So how good are they? Well, according to early church tradition, Matthew and John were two of the disciples, eyewitnesses who wrote those Gospels. Mark and Luke got their information from the disciples, eyewitnesses. So, if the church tradition is correct, if it's correct, and that's disputed, but if it's correct, then we would say Matthew and John are kings. They're eyewitnesses. So they're kings. And since Mark and Luke got their information, well, Mark got his information from Peter, that would make him a queen. And Luke, it's kind of difficult to know what he's saying. He's either saying he got his information from the eyewitnesses or he got his information from those who received it from the eyewitnesses. So he'd either be a queen or he'd be a jack, or maybe he's a little of each. Either way, if the church tradition is correct, that's a pretty good hand of cards. I'll take that. Now, we actually have a source that's better than any of those. And it's Paul. And he's our ace. And the reason Paul is good, number one, he claims to be an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. But the reason he's more than a king is because he was not a Christian at the time. In fact, he was out persecuting the church. He believed Jesus was a false prophet, a failed Messiah, that he was leading fellow Jews astray. And so he went out, he persecuted, he arrested, he imprisoned, consented to the execution of Christians, and then he became one because he had an experience that he believed was an appearance of a risen Jesus appearing to him. And it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. That makes him an ace. Now, here's something else that's cool about it. Paul ends up dying for his belief. He's beheaded just outside of Rome, so he so strongly believed that Jesus rose that he endured much suffering, imprisonment, beatings, stonings, and finally martyrdom because of his faith. He strongly believed it. He not only claimed Jesus rose, he actually believed it. Here's something else. He knew the Jerusalem apostles. So, in our New Testament, there are 13 letters attributed to Paul. And when you look at all the scholars, New Testament scholars in the world, many of which are skeptics, Whether we're talking about an atheist, agnostic, Jewish, liberal, moderate, conservative Christian, it's virtually unanimous that Paul wrote at least 7 of those letters. Conservatives are going to think he wrote more, liberals less, nobody thinks less than 7, okay? And some think that there are another 2 letters that Paul certainly wrote. And then there's some more in question, and I'm not here to talk about which ones he did or didn't. I'm just saying there are at least 7 letters that virtually everyone agrees on that Paul wrote them. So I'm only going to use those letters so that nobody can call into question and say, well, maybe Paul didn't say that. Okay? One of those undisputed letters is his letter to the church at Galatia. In chapter 1, Paul says, 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and he met with Peter, the lead apostle. Now, actually, it says there that the Greek word for meet or visiting with Peter is the term hysteresis. What English word do you think we get from that? History. And see, Paul, he wasn't a disciple of Jesus during his ministry. He knew enough about Jesus to think that he was dangerous, that he didn't believe what Paul was preaching. But he hadn't been around with Jesus, so he wanted to go up to Jerusalem and find out everything about him. So who better than Peter, the lead apostle, one of Jesus' 3 closest disciples? Can you imagine sitting down and talking to Peter about what Jesus did? Hey, Pete, when you guys finished the day ministering with Jesus and you sat around the campfire and eating, did he have a sense of humor? What kind of jokes did he tell? Did he ever drink too much wine? Pete, I heard that he walked on the water once. Is that true? I mean, come on, really? He did? And I heard that what? You walked on water too? What? Wouldn't that have been cool? 15 days, he said, he spent with Peter, hysteresis. Chapter 2, he says, 14 years later, he returns to Jerusalem and he meets with Peter, James, and John, who he calls the pillars of the church. And he does so it's the second time with Peter. Actually, Galatians 1 says he also saw James, the brother of Jesus, too. So Galatians 2, this is the second time he's meeting with Peter, the second time with James, and now John, the son of Zebedee, is there. And he says, I meet with these guys because I wanted to run the gospel past them that I'd been preaching to make sure I hadn't been working in vain all these years. Guys, I want to, this is what I've been preaching. I just want to make sure this is what you're preaching, right? This is the central gospel message. And Paul says that after hearing him, they certified that what he was preaching about his gospel message was correct. In other words, he says they gave me the right hand of fellowship. In 21st century United States, it's like fist bump, Paul. Good work, brother. Keep up the good job. Now, as a historian, we look at this and say, all right, Paul's saying they certified that what he says is true, but maybe Paul's lying. So as historians, we look for something to corroborate things. And we get some of this with Paul. So, for example, Jesus' disciples, some of them had disciples later on. Peter had one named Clement of Rome, and John had one named Polycarp. Now, some of you someday are going to get married, you're going to have kids, you're going to be thinking about names, and you have a son, just remember Polycarp. Right? And so we've got letters. One letter that Clement wrote, one letter that Polycarp wrote, and they're both writing after Paul's death, so it'll be interesting to see what do they say about Paul. Now, if they don't mention him, that's okay. If Paul was lying about meeting with Peter and John and James, well, then we would expect them to say something. If they're speaking about Paul, they'd probably say something negative about him. If he was telling the truth, maybe they'd say something positive about him. So let's see what they say. So Clement of Rome calls Paul the Blessed Paul, and he puts him on par with his mentor Peter. Polycarp says, and I quote, Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And then he quotes from Paul's letters and refers to them as part of these sacred scriptures. This is not the kind of things you say about Paul. if he's teaching differently than his mentor, John. These are precisely the kind of things that Clement and Polycarp would say if Paul was teaching the same thing as their mentors, Peter and John. I could give some more evidence that Paul was teaching the same thing that they were, but I'll move on from here. The point I just want to make here is this doesn't prove that Paul, everything he said is what they said. What it proves, at least when we come to the gospel message, the essentials of the Christian faith, that when we hear Paul in this, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. Now, that would be awesome then if we found somewhere in Paul's letters where he would say that here's the gospel message he preached. I mean, imagine maybe some archaeologists are digging around in Jerusalem and they find a lost letter of Paul. Did you know that we don't have all of Paul's letters? I think it's Colossians, you correct me since you're a Pauline scholar. I think it's Colossians at the very end. He says, and you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. Is that Colossians or Philippians? No? So one of those, Philippians or Colossians, I think it's Colossians. And you, for your part, read my letter that I wrote to the church at Laodicea. Oh, what letter to the church at Laodicea? That's not my New Testament. What if they found that letter? What if they found that letter? And, I mean, that'd be pretty cool. It's like, well, should we include that in our New Testaments? Boy, what a debate that would be, right? Yeah, but, you know, the early church, you got this criteria. The early church decided not to do it. And how do we know the criteria they used was correct? I mean, it's the Bible that's God's word, not the early church fathers, right? And, well, should we include it? Well, they must not have thought anything in it was important enough to do it. Well, what if we're reading through that letter and Paul says, hey, I'm writing to you because I'm understanding from Timothy, who came to me and reported that there are disputes amongst you because you read a copy of a letter I sent to the church at Rome, and you started to fight amongst one another what we meant by predestination and election. Something about a guy named Calvin, and broke out fistfights, and I want to clarify what I said to you. Then there'd be no more Calvinists. So that'd be kind of cool if we found a letter like that. So what if that letter said, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you? Oh, it's like, whoa! Well, we could certify that whatever the gospel message is, what Paul was preaching, that's what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. That's what those who had walked with Jesus, who knew him, who ministered with him, this is what they're proclaiming. We wouldn't even need the Gospels to know what they were proclaiming about Jesus' resurrection. We've got it right here. Well, we don't have that lost letter, but we don't need it. Because 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1, Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. And in the verses that follow, verses 3 through 7, Paul gives us that gospel message in an outline form as in terms of oral tradition. Because only about 10% of the people in that day could read, less than that could write, and so they taught each other through oral tradition. It's not like the game of whispers, where I whisper something in your ear, and I whisper something in your ear, and you pass it. You know how the game goes, and by the time you get to the back, it's something different, right? No, they had ways to put it stylized and to make it easier to remember. And we find something like this in 1 Corinthians 15, and this oral tradition, verses 3 through 5. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Those two terms, delivered and received, typically mean the imparting of oral tradition. And then he says this, Christ died for our sins according, well, as I say this, here's another way we know this is oral tradition. One of the ways that they would, if I said to you, let me tell you something, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. You know that this is in a stylized form because there's a rhythm and there's a rhyme to it, right? Well, they could pick up things like this too. And one of the ways they would do it is they would do something called parallelism. long, short, long, short. So get a load of this. First, Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received. I'm giving you oral tradition. Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. Oral tradition. And then he provides a list of the appearances. To Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time. Then he adds a parenthetical statement, most of whom are still alive, but some have died. In other words, some of these people are still alive. You can ask them about what they saw. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and then Paul said, last of all, he appeared to me. So 3 individual appearances, Peter, James, and Paul. Of course, he got that information directly from Peter and James, whom we met with. He's an eyewitness himself. And then he's got 3 group appearances. To the 12, to more than 500, and to all the apostles. Now, the group appearances are profound, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then Paul says, whether I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believe. Now, in English, the word preach doesn't tell us much at all. But in Greek, it's the word kerugma, or the verb keruso, from which we say kerygma, the official public proclamation. In fact, when I was in Sweden, I asked them what their Bibles said on this, because verse 1 says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you, and then so gospel message I preached to you, and then this says, this is what we preached to you. There's 2 different words in Greek, but 1 in English. And in Swedish, there are 2 different words. So I don't know what it is in Danish. Is it 2 different words? Okay, good. It's important to notice that this is kerygma here. Official formal proclamation. And Paul's saying, this is kerygma. This is what the apostles preached. This is what I'm preaching. This is what you believe. The death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and his appearances to individuals and groups, to friend, and even at least one foe. Now that's pretty neat. How early is this? Well, 1 Corinthians, we're not sure exactly when it was written, but probably no later than the year 55. All right, now Jesus, we're not certain when he was crucified. It's either the year 30 or 33. Okay, so let's just call it the year 30. This is the year 30. And then we come over here in 1 Corinthians, it's written in, let's just call it 55, the later date, earlier and the later date. So at the very most, you got 25 years separating when this letter was written and Jesus is crucified. Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received. So he delivered it to them earlier than this. He delivered it when he set up the first Lutheran church of Corinth around the year 51. And he says, I delivered to you what I also received, so he received it before then. So he received it probably no later than the year 50. Could have been in Damascus right after he was saved. It could have been during missionary trips in the meantime when he was traveling with Silas and Barnabas. It could have been a trip to Jerusalem and to talk to Peter and James, or the second one when he talked to Peter, James, and John. We don't know. But he probably received it from an apostle with apostolic authority and tradition going back to the apostles. So we're within 20 years, and it's coming from the eyewitnesses. That's pretty profound. So this is what we're hearing: death, burial, resurrection, appearances. Now, what do we get out of this? Paul is our best source. We're not even talking about the Gospels. We've only considered one source, Paul. He's our best source because he's hostile at the time of his conversion. He's an early source. He claims to be an eyewitness. He knew Jesus' disciples, and we can certify that he's preaching the same gospel message they're preaching. And they're preaching, we get from this 3 things. Number 1, Jesus' disciples taught that he was raised from the dead. Number 2, Jesus' disciples taught that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. In individuals and groups, friend and foe alike. By the way, the first one, because they taught he was raised from the dead, it wasn't a legend that developed over time. This can be traced right back to the original disciples. You could say they're lying or whatever, hallucinating, but it's not something that developed over time. The fact that they taught that Jesus appeared to individuals, to groups, to friend and foe alike, like I said, it's profound in group appearances, and here's why.
A lot of research has been done over hallucinations for the past more than a century. Multiple studies. Hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. You are perceiving something with your senses that's not really there. You have a visual hallucination, you are seeing something that's not there. If it's an auditory hallucination, you are hearing something that's a sound that's not really there. There's an olfactory hallucination where you smell something that's not there. A gustatory hallucination, you're tasting something that's not there. A tactile hallucination, you feel like something's touching you or you're touching something. It's kind of like when you first got your mobile phone and you come to church or your class and you put it on vibrate. And during the event, you thought you felt the phone vibrate and you got a text message and you pulled it out and you flipped it open. Nobody loves me. False alarm, that's called a tactile hallucination. Most of us have experienced that at some point. Others don't experience, like, they're not contagious, so it's like if I had that false alarm and didn't move, the person next to me would say, hey, why don't you check your phone? I think it just, you got a text. How do you know? You know, it's not a hallucination if that's the case, right? Kinesthetic hallucination, a sense of motion. You ever have a dream that you were falling and you woke up? That is called a kinesthetic hallucination, a sense of motion. So we've all experienced them at some sort. Not everybody experiences visual hallucinations. The group most likely to experience a hallucination of any sort is someone who has lost their loved one. And only 7% of them experience a visual hallucination. 100% of Jesus' disciples said they saw the risen Jesus. He appeared to them. In terms of the group hallucinations, it said they're not group experiences because there are occurrences in the mind of an individual. They don't have any external reality. In that sense, hallucinations are like dreams. I could not wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having this dream I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation. You can't do that, right? We might both dream that we're in Maui, but it's not the same dream. We can't participate in the same dream because it's happening in our brain. No external reality. So you can't have a group hallucination. You can have a group optical illusion, but not our group mistaken identity, but you wouldn't have a group hallucination. And yet, we've got he appeared to 12, he appeared to more than 500 at one time, he appeared to all the apostles. 3 of them. And then, what about Paul? Paul's not grieving Jesus' death. Again, he thought Jesus was a false prophet and failed Messiah. Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. And we haven't even used the Gospels, but if we did, I'd say, what about the empty tomb? We've got some evidence for the empty tomb. If they hallucinated the appearances of Jesus, that doesn't explain how the tomb got empty. So there's all kinds of problems with the hallucination hypothesis. It just doesn't work. Oh, and the third one, Jesus' disciples were willing to suffer and endure martyrdom for their preaching. We have at least 14 sources that shows that the disciples and Paul were willing to suffer and at least were willing to go to their martyrdom for their gospel proclamation, which suggests that they weren't lying. They sincerely believed it. Liars make poor martyrs. Now maybe you're thinking, you know what, we hear stories about Islamic jihadists who do suicide runs, they blow themselves up, and that doesn't mean, they're willing to die for that doesn't mean that what they believe is true. That's correct. We could say the same thing that Christians who die martyr deaths by ISIS today and have their heads chopped off. Because they're willing to die, that doesn't show that Christianity is true. All it shows is they believe Christianity is true. Muslim jihadists, the fact that they're willing to die for Islam doesn't prove Islam is true, but it shows they believe Islam is true. Correct, right?
The disciples' willingness to suffer and die shows that they believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's what I'm saying. They weren't lying. But there is something else there, though. When Christians who are martyred today die for what they believe, Christians, whether we endure persecution or martyrdom or whatever, we do it for what we believe is true, but honestly, we don't know that it's true. For all we know, it's possible it's wrong. There's an element of faith. Islamic jihadists, they're dying for what they believe is true. Okay? The disciples were dying for what they either knew was true or knew was false. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, they would have known it. And yet they were dying for their testimony that Jesus had risen and had appeared to them. Again, liars men before martyrs. So they weren't lying. You start to run out of explanations. What I'm saying is just from the Paul and from that one little text that we just looked at in the last few minutes, just from that, we get enough evidence to show that the disciples sincerely believed that risen Jesus had appeared to them, that it was important. And we see it wasn't a legend, it wasn't a hallucination, and they weren't lying. And at the end of the day, the best explanation for the evidence is that Jesus rose from the dead. And I get pretty excited about that. This guy who has doubts at times, I want evidence, I want facts. If I'm going to give my life for this, if there's a chance in the future that I may have to endure persecution, I want to know that it's true. I don't want to do it just because I like Jesus' teachings. I don't want to do it as a psychological or emotional crutch, or just have something to believe. I got better things. If Christianity is not true, I got better things to do with my time and money than to come to church on Sunday. Sorry, Pastor, it's just how I feel. I don't want to come to church if it's false. And I don't want to give you any money if it's false. But if it's true, then we should be in church on Sunday. We should give money to the church. You like that? So we should really throw ourselves into Christianity because this is the most important thing in our life. It's going to determine eternity for us. We should follow Jesus unreservedly and be willing to give everything for him. But I want evidence for it before I do it. I think we have that evidence. It encourages me. And for practical living day to day, hey, look, many of you, I'm sure, are going through some tough times right now. Different things. Maybe some of you lost your job recently. I don't know if that happens here. Maybe it doesn't happen here in Denmark. It happens a lot in the U.S., okay? Where people lose their jobs, companies downsize, and you don't fit their size anymore. Or maybe your marriage just blew up. Or you have a relationship and that just blew up. And you were engaged to someone, and now that person doesn't want to marry you, and you're devastated. Or you're getting divorced, or you just found out you have cancer or something. And it's really bothering you. What the resurrection of Jesus can do is it encourages you because it helps put everything in perspective to say, God really cares about you. He loves you. He might seem silent. I'm sure he seemed silent to Mary and Martha when their brother Lazarus was dead and Jesus let it happen. It's like God always shows up late, if he shows up at all. But he knows what he's doing. And he's working on us to mold us to become more like Christ. And a lot of times that is his goal for us is holiness, not happiness. And so we go through this life, we become more like Christ, but the resurrection guarantees us eternal life. It tells us that we matter to God, that he loves us, and that things are going to be okay. And that's what it means to me. And I get encouraged by that. All right, so how about if we open it up for some questions?
Hi, my name is Elon. Thank you for your excellent talk. My question is concerning 1 Corinthians 15, where you talked about there being, at most like 20 years is what you said, right? When you listen to a guy like William Greg, for example, he'll say something like at the most 5 years. And I think I've heard him say that Bart Ehrman is willing to go as far as 1 year close to the death of Jesus. So I was just curious why you are more conservative, or whatever you want to call it, in your estimation.
Yeah, great question. Well, even James D.G. Dunn says we can be entirely confident that it had formed within 6 months. So my question to those scholars would be, how do you know that? Where do you get that from? Even skeptical scholars are willing to back that oral tradition up to, within a year or two of the crucifixion. But I want to know, how do they get that? So when I'm doing my research, I'm doing it not to, I want to see what we can prove about the resurrection, but my primary interest is truth. Did he rise? What's the evidence? And if it can be used to prove the resurrection and show that Christianity is true, fantastic, but I'm primarily after truth. So as I'm looking through all this, I'm seeing all the scholars doing it. So if I were doing it just for merely apologetic purposes to defend the faith, I'd be saying, yeah, look, this is what all these scholars say here. We can get this within 6 months or 1 to 2 years. Even the guys at the Jesus Seminar allude to an atheist New Testament scholar. But I'm interested in truth. So when I'm looking at this, I say, okay, Paul's given it to them in 55, if not earlier. He says, I delivered to you, when I first set up the church, what I also received. So we know it's at least, at the very latest, it's sometime in 51, a month or so before he sets up the church there. We know that's the absolute latest date he could have received it. But when did he receive it? We don't know. And some say, well, those who like to back it up say, well, okay, like within 1 to 2 years, they'll say, well, maybe Paul received it, 3 years after his conversion when he goes up to Jerusalem. So maybe this is, say, 5 years after the crucifixion, and that's already in play, it's probably within a year. Still, we don't know that. As far as we know the apostles were claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them. He appeared to Peter, the 12, and all that. But the time that it got stylized into this oral tradition and passed along to Paul, we don't know. So I'm just trying to be honest with the data that we have and say, what can we prove? Well, we can prove he gets it, it can't be later than 51, and it's probably earlier, perhaps much earlier than that. And it certainly goes back to the eyewitnesses. So whether it was 20 years later or 2 months later, it's coming from the eyewitnesses. So that's what I go with. And when you look at the reasons, they usually don't give any reasons why they put it at those dates. They just say it. So when I see a skeptic give a date like that, it's like, well, that's cool that they acknowledge it. They know it's early, but they usually don't give any reason. So that's why I'm just being cautious and not going beyond what I think the evidence actually shows.
Anyone else? Just raise your hand.
What do you think is the best argument a non-Christian can come up with against the reliability of the resurrection of Jesus?
I think if I were not going to believe the resurrection, I think the best argument you could come up with would be there's just not enough evidence. It's just not enough. To say it's hallucination doesn't work. To say they lied or it was a myth, it doesn't work. To say, like John Dominic Crossan says, that it's just a metaphor, I think those things are easily refuted. To say these things don't happen today, I think that's irrelevant. I don't expect my grandfather or my mom or dad to be raised from the dead. They're just people. If Jesus was who he claimed to be, God's uniquely divine Son, I expect a resurrection. It shouldn't surprise me. So that it's different. So again, I think the best argument that would be given by non-believers is like, well, that's pretty interesting. I don't know what happened, but it's not enough to convince me. So I would think that's the best.
What would you answer, Peter?
So if a skeptic raised that, I'd say, well, I can appreciate that. What would it take to convince you? And then I'd want to know whether it's truly an objection. So sometimes I'll ask a person, look, if Jesus rose from the dead, would you become a Christian? If you knew for a fact he rose from the dead? I've asked that of 3 skeptics. I've asked it of more than 3 skeptics, but 3 skeptics who I've asked it to said no. So it's like, well, this is just a game then. Why am I even talking to you? If you wouldn't believe, if you wouldn't become a Christian, even if it could be proven beyond any doubt that Jesus rose from the dead, then why are we even talking about this? You can raise all these questions, but you're really not open to it. So, but if it's not an emotional objection like that, and they're really interested, I would just get a little more in depth with the conversation with them. Talk about the evidence some more. And of course, there's going to have to be a part that faith is involved, because no historian can get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify their conclusions. Like I said, we always wish we had more cards. We wish the cards we had were better, but we got to play the hand we've been dealt. So no matter what it is, and no matter what worldview one takes, even if they take an agnostic or atheist worldview, that takes faith too. Because they got to look at the evidence for the resurrection and say, no, I'm not going to believe. They got to look at the scientific evidence from astrophysics and molecular biology and say, well, yes, it really does appear that the universe was designed and that life was the product of design. But I'm going to choose to believe that it's a natural explanation. And that that's just all coincidence that it looks like design. It still takes faith. Because again, none of us can get into the time machine and go back and verify our worldview. So no matter what we believe, it takes faith.
I'm Martin. What's your take on the Gospel according to Mark chapter 16, where we have the women going to the grave, and it ends up with a total disaster, I can say. They flee from the grave with confusion and sorrow and so on. Do you take that as a... I mean, tonight we've mostly looked on Paul as a proper evidence, but what about that?
Well, it doesn't say out of confusion and sorrow. It said out of fear and trembling they fled, right? It said nothing to know of. And then it ends there. And I don't know how it is in your translations, but whether I'm reading the Greek New Testament or English translations, there's usually some brackets there around verses 9 through 20 and saying that these do not appear in the best manuscripts, or probably not in the original. And that's almost certainly true. So why does Mark end like that, with the women fleeing out of fear and trembling and saying nothing to no one? Does that mean that they don't know about the appearances, or that the appearances were invented later on? Well, first of all, Paul mentions the appearances in 1 Corinthians 15 before any of the Gospels were written. So it's not like Mark wouldn't have known of the appearances. Moreover, in chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus tells them, his disciples, that after he is raised from the dead, he will go ahead of them to Galilee and meet them there. And that's why in chapter 16, verse 7, the angel tells the women that he has been raised from the dead. Now go, tell the disciples and Peter that he's gone ahead of them to Galilee, and there they will see him just as he told you. So Mark knows that Jesus told them he's going to appear to them in Galilee. Mark knows that the angel tells the women that he's going ahead, and they're to go tell the male disciples to go to Galilee, there they will see him. And Mark knows about these appearances from the disciples, because Paul was saying it. And where does Paul get this tradition? From the disciples in Jerusalem, one of which is Peter, whom he had met with. And Mark was reporting what he remembered Peter telling him. So the question, we have 2 questions here. Number 1 is, why did it said, out of fear and trembling, they said nothing to no one?
And number two, why doesn't he mention the appearances? So the saying nothing to no one, that same grammar is used in chapter 1, verse 44, where Jesus heals a leper and says, now go show yourself to the high priest as Moses commanded, and show the priest, say nothing to no one, and go show yourself to the priest what the Lord has done. What it means is don't stop along the way and talk to anyone, go straight to the priest. And that's the same language that is used to the women. Out of fear and trembling, he said nothing to no one. So why does it stop there? Well, if they said nothing to no one, how does Mark know about it? And I've just given you a number of reasons why he would have known about it. Jesus predicted it, the angel said it. Paul says this is what the disciples were saying. One of those disciples was Peter, and Mark is writing down what Peter said. Scholars have given a number of reasons why Mark does not have the appearances in his gospel. And the appearances are legion. It's like when there's 5 New Testament scholars opining on this, there are 7 reasons. Different reasons. One of the reasons is that the Mark, well, I forgot what scholar it was, but it's like this Gospel of Mark was being read. It was written to be delivered as an oral story, okay, to a storyteller, to be memorized and read. And then it's one of Jesus' disciples who is reading it, and then whoever's reading it fills in their own experience of when Jesus appeared to them. Possible. Or he's saying this too because they want to downplay the women and get them out of there. And it's like, let the people say, we're supposed to be the witnesses that Jesus rose from the dead. Because the women were disobedient. They said nothing to no one. Possible. Or, at that point, people in the audience are to share about their experience of seeing the risen Jesus. Possible. None of those can be proven. A number of scholars think that either Mark's ending has been lost or he was unable to complete it for some reason. And that's why it ends abruptly. That's kind of where I think it probably got lost or Mark was unable to end it. So that's where I'm at. But I don't think there is any reason to conclude like some skeptical scholars like to do and say, see, Mark didn't know of any of the appearances. And so he knows of an empty tomb, and it was a spiritual resurrection, and it's not till later where they have these appearances of this physically raised Jesus. Paul talks about a physically raised Jesus before 1 Corinthians, before Mark even writes his gospel. So, a number of those reasons, I just don't think those are good explanations. So, bottom line, we don't know why he doesn't mention the appearances, but he does seem to know about them, in my opinion.
Could we claim that it's kind of a bold way to choose to what's the word? Express your gospel, for Mark. So to start out with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, or Son of Man, that's where he starts, and then he has the courage to end up with this kind of disaster, because the gospel as a whole has the force to withstand any doubts, or he actually has the courage, and he's convinced that his gospel as a whole is capable of convincing people about its truth, even though he doesn't end up with any eyewitness of Jesus as a raised, or Jesus risen from the dead.
So let me see if I'm understanding you on that. It's almost as though he wants to convince people about who Jesus is, and he tells the story of Jesus raising from the dead, but he doesn't mention the appearances because the readers aren't going to see an appearance, and there's an element of faith.
guess I'm not
No,
exactly following.
I'm not speaking clearly enough, I guess. But well, to me, it's a very firm argument, I guess that well, there's definitely an element of belief, but to me, it's really an argument or proof that the Gospels are not invented or, constructed to tell a lie. Because how would you ever construct a lie like this and end up with this kind of disaster? The main character dies, and the people who followed him end up with confusion.
But if he rose from the dead, Mark reports he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
If he appeared and the angels telling the women that Jesus said he was going to appear to his disciples in Galilee, now go tell them to go up there, what would be the harm in narrating an appearance to the disciples in Galilee? How would that conflict with what you're saying Mark's objective is?
I'll think about that.
Hey, my name is Kristen. I have two questions. Would you agree with me that pride is the reason why mankind have hard time believing in the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
I missed one word you said. Would I agree that something is the reason why people...
Pride.
Pride.
Yeah. Sin.
Maybe in some cases, sure.
Yeah.
Because it would show Christianity's true and they don't want to submit to God. I suppose that is the case with some people, sure.
The second question is, somewhere Paul says that he wrote in his letters that if those he was writing to, if they do not believe in the resurrection, that their faith is in vain, and they were still in their former unbelief and something like that. So you mentioned also earlier that the early church, the early apostles who died, they died because they believed that Christ really rose from the dead and the resurrection was true, and that's why they died. But today we die because we die for our faith, those who have been killed, because they have faith, if I understood you correctly. And I'm kind of wondering, why wouldn't we die also today, just as the early believers, even though we don't have an eyewitness of the resurrection? Why can't we die as the early believers, just as if we have seen the resurrection? Because even though we have not seen the resurrection, we do experience it in our lives. If you get what I'm saying.
I don't. I'm sorry.
James, Peter, and John, they died because of what they believed in.
Yeah.
Because they've seen Christ rose from the dead. But today, you said that we die because we believe that they said that Christ
Right.
rose.
They died for what they knew was either true or false. We're dying for what we believe is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is, why can't we also die as if we have seen and witnessed the resurrection? Because we do witness the resurrection power in our own lives after believing in
Because we
Christ.
experience the resurrection in our own lives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because when he say, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one
Yeah.
comes to the Father except through me. When we receive him, we do experience the resurrection power in our own lives. I don't know about others, but through the Holy.
Yeah,
mean, I suppose technically speaking, we could say, you know, if you've seen miracles, and I think I've seen some miracles. I think I know some people who have experienced miracles, real miracles. I've got a friend, Craig Keener, who's written 2 volumes, and he's documented within those many miracles that have happened even in modern times, even in his own lifetime with people he knows, his mother-in-law for one, who lives over in the Congo. So, yeah, when someone sees something like that, they see miracles, and I mean, that can certainly bolster our faith and give us faith that Christianity is true. To have the power of the resurrection in our lives, I think, can also be evidence. We can see that through answered prayer, through the fruit of the Spirit, and things that God does through us. I just still wouldn't put that on the same, it's not the same as like, you know, my mom died 5 years ago, my dad 4 years ago. If they were to walk through that door right now and come up here, it's that'd be pretty cool. I mean, that's in a different league, I think, of evidence than some of the other things that we experience, as impressive as they could be. So that would just be my opinion on that matter.
So, I was wondering, you mentioned that when Paul is citing the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, he's adding the words, and some are still alive, and some have fallen asleep. I'm wondering, how do we know for a fact that the 500s were part of the original creedal material? Because I mean, if there really was 500 people, it would have been quite impressive, and that would be, to me at least, some quite strong evidence for the reliability of the resurrection. But how do we know that the 500, given the fact that they aren't mentioned in any of the Gospels, for instance, how do we know that Paul didn't just add that in his giving this creed in his letter? How do we know that this is part of the original creedal material?
Well, I think the parenthetical statement that he puts in there, when he says, most of whom are still alive, but some have died, suggests that he's saying, you can check this out if you want. And why would you say that if you're making it up? Now, someone might come back and say, well, but he's writing this to the church at Corinth. That would have been too far from Jerusalem when this appearance would have probably occurred. But then I'd say, well, there certainly would have been merchants in that church that could have, probably gone to Jerusalem at some point, and they could have checked it out. Plus this early oral tradition, he's saying, I delivered to you what I also received, and this is what we preached, this is what you believed. So if they met, any of those people ever met another disciple, apostle who came by to preach to them, they could ask them and prove Paul a liar. And if this is an oral tradition that has been passed along to Paul, then it originates in Jerusalem. And even if people in Corinth could have checked it out, people in Jerusalem could have. They would have known that. So it's also in all the manuscripts. There's no manuscript that would omit that particular appearance. I do think it's interesting that we find it in 1 Corinthians 15 in Paul's letters, but we don't find it in any of the Gospels. And the question is why? We don't know the answer to that. That doesn't really trouble me. Now, if it were in, say, John, the latest Gospel, but wasn't anywhere else, Paul or the other Gospels, that would be a different thing. Then someone would say, oh, that was made up in the latest Gospel. It just happens to be in the earliest report of Jesus' resurrection. So the thing is, why didn't the others mention it? There's a possible few cases where it could be, like maybe it's the appearance of Jesus in Galilee to the disciples, where in Matthew 28:17 it says this, some worshipped him, but others doubted. I don't think that's the reason, because I've got a different explanation about the others doubted. That I think it's, in my opinion, it's certain. So it wouldn't involve that. Paul's
appearance. The appearance to Paul doesn't appear in the Gospels. The appearance to James doesn't appear in the Gospels. Why not to James? By the time it's 40 days and Pentecost comes along, they're in the upper room with Jesus' mother, sister, and brothers praying. So even though Jesus' brothers were not followers, probably all the way up to his crucifixion, they have become followers within 50 days after Passover. So how did that happen? And it seems to me the best explanation is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:7. Then he appeared to James. It was not narrated in the Gospels. But then you've got the appearance on the Sea of Galilee. It's only in John. You got the appearance to the Emmaus disciples. It's only in Luke. You got the appearance to Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Is only in Matthew, or is only in John. So they're each given different appearances, and it could be because they are providing the appearances that had been given them by eyewitnesses. It's just a guess. But the appearance to the 500, if you just look at that one, that's one. But then again, you got to look at the appearance on the Sea of Galilee, the appearance to James, the appearance to Mary Magdalene, the appearance to the Emmaus disciples. Each gospel is reporting different ones. So I don't think they all have to report the same ones. I think there's some, yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Nino. And you spoke about oral traditions, just like we have here a long history in the Nordic countries of oral traditions. We know, as a fact, that the victor always writes history, more or less.
Not always.
Not always.
Thucydides wrote one of the best histories in antiquity, the history of the Peloponnesian War, and he was on the losing side. Xenophon was on the losing side. Josephus was on the losing side.
More or less.
Yeah, so there are plenty of exceptions.
More or less, yeah, of course. How would you say that the oral traditions in the Christian tradition differentiates from the ones of the Nordic, where Saxo and many other scholars wrote of all the encounters with great warriors and great warlords and all of this after their death and long gone history? How would you say?
Great question. Great question. So we could talk maybe on a similar. I can't speak of the Nordic traditions because I don't know them. All right, so I speak blindly with this. I have no idea how reliable they are, or the value in being passed down, and what they thought about allowing legend. I know in the Hindu traditions, a Hindu scholar at Rutgers University told me that he translated the Bhagavad Gita for Penguin Classics too. So, I mean, he's a respected Hindu scholar, and he said that the Hindus will pass along stories in the Hindu tradition, and even today, they allow more legendary influence to continue to go with it, and that's okay with them. So, you know, you could ask, well, in the Nordic traditions, was that okay for that? And did they allow some of these traditions to, like, have a snowball effect, and the stories grow for national pride, or the pride in an ethnicity? Did that happen? It certainly happened with Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, where traditions came. In fact, by the time you get to Cicero, in the 1st century BC, in one of his letters, he mentions about Romulus and a whole legend about him being a feral child, and Romulus and Remus being raised by a wolf and a woodpecker. That we shouldn't look too carefully at these stories, he says, for their historicity. And these things were like invented, and there was probably a historical Romulus, and he was probably killed when he, you know, by the Senate and the other leaders when he was becoming a tyrant, and the story just grew over time and legend got in there. That took a long time. When we're looking at the Christian accounts, the stuff about the resurrection that we're getting is within just a few decades. And it's rooted in eyewitness testimony.
So the Nordic tradition, I don't know how long that story is from the originals. But with the Christian tradition, it's very close, and it's coming out when the eyewitnesses are still alive and can be traced back to them. One further thing I'll say, and then I'll let you follow up here. When we talk, there's T.N.D. Menninger, who is one of the, I think he's a Swedish scholar. He put out a monograph in 2001 called The Riddle of Resurrection. A very good scholar, a very careful scholar. And in the beginning, in the introduction of his book, he says that it is the consensus of scholars today that the Christians did not borrow the idea of dying and rising gods from pagan religions. He says, but he's going to take exception to that. And he's good. Oh, and forgive me, let me correct that. He says it's the consensus of scholars that there were no traditions of dying and rising gods that predate Christianity. But he says he was going to take exception to that. And in this monograph, he sets out a case that there were at least 3 and perhaps as many as 5. In the end, he says none of these may apply, but he says all 5 of these are tied to the agricultural cycles. So the god dies, and therefore that's to explain the drought in the summer. And when he rises from the dead, that's to explain why the rain comes and there's growth and brings life to the crops. And it always involves figures who lived in the distant gray past for which there's no date involved. It's once upon a time that this happened. He says, but with the Christians and resurrection, it's not tied to the agricultural cycles. It's like a fulfillment of prophecy. The eyewitnesses are saying it. The stories are circulating while the alleged eyewitnesses are still alive. And so in his appendix, when he says this, he says the Christians could not have borrowed from pagan myths. So where did they come up with resurrection? And he says the riddle remains. So anyway, go ahead. If you come back with another thought, I'd be happy to entertain it.
Hi. What are the evidence for the resurrection around the empty tomb, the guards who protected the grave, risking their lives? Is that a clear question? Do you have how do you...
So I would there's several evidences we could give for the empty tomb, okay? Like number one, I would point out that the story is that Jesus is buried in Jerusalem. We know he's crucified in Jerusalem. Tacitus and Josephus mention it. Bar Serapi and Lucian mention about Jesus. Lucian mentions Jesus being crucified in Palestine. And then you've got Tacitus saying he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, of course, who was the governor of Judea. Josephus says he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. So it's going to happen in Jerusalem. Jesus is given a burial in Jerusalem. So how is it, if he's buried, if they say he was raised from the dead and his body is still in a tomb or in a grave, how are they going to get away with that? You know, when that body could just be exposed. Now the Jews wouldn't go and try to expose it because they would have been ceremonially defiled. And certainly the Romans wouldn't have had such of those kind of sensitivities, and they couldn't have exposed the body. So it seems like it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in Jerusalem with the body if the location of Jesus' body was known, because they could have just exposed it, or anyone saying they went to the tomb, yep, we saw Jesus, even if they'd gone to the wrong tomb and they saw a body that even looked like Jesus's, of the same stature, you know, it would have caused some serious question about their claim. Also, you've got, like in Matthew's Gospel, when it says the disciples stole the body and the guards fell asleep, then you've got Matthew saying, and that story is still circulated by the Jews even to this day. So his readers would have known this. It's like, well, why are the skeptics responding by saying the disciples stole the body? Well, that implies itself that the tomb was empty. If when I was in elementary school and I go into the class, I guess you guys call it lower school, and I go into class and I'm supposed to turn in my homework and I say the dog ate it. That tells the teacher I don't have it. And when you say the disciples stole the body, that is to say it's not in the tomb. They're trying to provide an explanation for it. Later on, you find Tertullian saying that people were saying the gardener reburied the body because he was afraid that people coming to visit Jesus' tomb would trample over his lettuce patch. So that's why the tomb was empty. Or Celsus in the middle of the 2nd century says that Jesus faked his death. Again, that would be a reason to explain the empty tomb. Now, in terms of the guards, could we say, well, the guards being there, they wouldn't have allowed someone to steal the body because that would have been their own necks on the block. I've heard that used many times. I don't buy that. Plutarch tells the story of Julius Caesar when he is he's kidnapped at one point. This is before he becomes big. This is when Caesar's young. And he gets kidnapped by some pirates. And then he's fleeing. I think it was from, who was he fleeing from? Sulla, I think it was. Sulla was a tyrant, the last dictator of Rome. Interesting, this just dawned on me. He was the last dictator of Rome until Julius Caesar. So he's after Caesar, and Caesar flees, and Sulla sends some troops out to get Caesar, and a centurion finds him, and Caesar bribes him to let him go. And they go, and he's free, and Sulla doesn't catch him. So the Gospel of Matthew says that the Jewish leaders bribed the soldiers to say that they fell asleep and the disciples stole the body. That sounds plausible to me, without them being killed. So I wouldn't use that as evidence to say, well, they would have been killed. I've heard, if they let someone come by, they'd be killed. Well, in most circumstances, yeah. There are exceptions, and we know that. Does that answer your question, or did I avoid it, or miss it? Okay.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time. Thank you very much, Mike. Give him an applause.